Hello, everyone. Happy St. Patrick's Day and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Christine Udds, editor of Food in Canada, Canada's only national food and beverage processing magazine. On behalf of Food in Canada and the Canadian Institute of Food Science and Technology, welcome to our 2021 Table Talks webinar series, The Learning Trough, where we bring you regular webinars that explore the future of food. If you haven't already, please visit CIFST's website for a list of upcoming webinars, which will be continuing every second week until June and then run again between September and November. If you are a member of CIFST, registration for the entire webinar series is free. Thank you to Dempsey Food for their generous sponsorship of our webinar series. Today's topic is Food Processing Skills Canada, Canada's 2020 Labour Market Information Survey Report findings. Our speaker is Kevin Elder, who is the Project Manager, Labour Market Information for Food Processing Skills Canada. Kevin grew up in Alberta and California. He studied international development at the University of Calgary and went on to live and work all over the globe, including managing a vapor heat treatment facility at an Australian mango processing plant. Kevin joined Food Processing Skills Canada in 2017 and has worked on labor market information studies on meat processing, fish and seafood processing, dairy processing, bakery processing, and other food processing. Welcome, Kevin. Before we get into Kevin's presentation, I just want to ask you a few questions so that we can get to know you a little bit better, Kevin. So here we go. Did you take up baking during COVID? And if you did, what is your favorite thing to bake?
Well, I didn't take it up. I've been doing it for a while, but I have a family cookbook with all different recipes, and we've been working our way through the cookie recipes. And my favorite one it's called Mrs. Ballantyne's Shortbread Cookies. And Mrs. Ballantyne was a friend of my great-grandmother in Moose Jaw. And so I've got 100-year-old shortbread recipe that we augmented by my son imprinting dinosaur footprints into them and filling them with icing. So we've got a modern twist on an old shortbread recipe.
That's great. What do you miss most during COVID?
Well, I think other than the obvious of being able to see people, I really miss traveling and getting out around, especially I was just speaking with some other parents at the school drop-off about how we miss going to conferences and actually getting to see people that are in the same line of work as us and connect with them and you know, just all the stuff that happens where you have an interesting session, you can talk about it afterwards, and getting to go for a walk in a different part of the country. So I miss that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. Thank you very much, Kevin. And before I turn it over to you, I just want to mention to everyone that if you have any questions, you can write them in the question box. I will be moderating any questions at the end, and Kevin will attempt to answer them before the end of the webinar. You can also download a PDF of Kevin's presentation, and you will find it under the handout section in GoToWebinar. And without further ado, please welcome Kevin Elder.
Thank you very much. Thank you to CIFT and Food in Canada for having me here. I'm just trying to, oh, I was clicking on the wrong spot. There we go. Oh, now I'm ahead of myself. So I'm with Food Processing Skills Canada. We're your leader in skills development. I've included our wheel that shows all the different activities that we do at FPSC, of which labor market information is just one small part. And I could easily spend the entire presentation walking you through all the different aspects of what we do. But I encourage you to go to the website and check out our work in all through different aspects of food and beverage processing. But I specifically didn't put the link here because I don't want to lose you now. What I'm here to talk about today is our survey that we did for the entire food and beverage processing sector. This survey was looking back at the year 2019 and was conducted we started in February, and we extended the questions all the way through to May of 2020, just as the sort of pandemic and state of emergency caused a big wrinkle in our plans for how the survey was going. But we did get 740 responses from different food and beverage manufacturing facilities. And the facilities were located all across the country. We had respondents from every province and every food and beverage sector, except for cannabis, which is pretty new, so I wasn't surprised that we didn't get any respondents there. And we had the most from meat processing and the most from Ontario and Quebec were the biggest representations in the survey. We asked, I think there was about 30 different questions that we asked. I'm not going to walk through all of them, but a lot of them were just to figure out who we were speaking with. And so one of the questions that we asked was whether respondents produce their own product in their own facility, whether they outsource production to another facility, or whether they do both. And I wasn't really expecting to have many people that outsource respond, and so 2% was higher than I'd expected, because I just wasn't aware of how many companies were doing that sort of activity. We also looked at where products were sold, and it was interesting to get quite a range of companies that didn't sell outside of their own province, and some that only sold locally. So to me, we did get quite a good mix of larger multinational corporations and large companies that export all over the world, as well as to the United States, as well as mid-sized and small companies. So we got a pretty representative sample that I was happy with, and the team of economists that were helping me on the study were also quite happy with. And we took all of the information that we had and looked at the makeup of the facilities that answered our survey. And so we had just over 100 as the average amount of people working in facilities, of which 85.8 of those positions would be permanent full-time. And one of the numbers that jumped out at me was nearly 6 of those positions were vacant for every employer. And then we also looked at the percentages, and we asked specifically about a number of groups that are underrepresented in the workforce, just to see how well represented that they are within food and beverage processing. And so we also asked about those underrepresented groups and whether or not there was a targeted effort to recruit them. And we found that targeting youth was the #1 area where people were looking to recruit, specifically young people under 30. And when we looked at that by sector, seafood was the highest by quite a margin at 77. And it's not surprising, because one of the other things that we looked at was the workforce that's over 55. And seafood was also the highest in that area as well. So there's definitely a retirement wave that's going to hit seafood. And so it makes sense that they're targeting the youth. And when we were looking at immigration, we asked specifically about recent immigration, which are people that have arrived within the last 5 years. And we had 9% of the workforce was made up of recent immigrants. And looking back at the 2016 census, we can see that there's 31% of the food and beverage processing workforce that's immigrant all years of arrival. And so that just tells us that we're, as a sector, doing a good job of retaining the workers that are coming to us. And I think it was 7% that were recent immigrants in the 2016 census, so that number has gone up. And Canada-wide, the whole economy is about 22%. So food and beverage processing is doing a better job at employing immigrants than other sectors. And we also looked at the sort of languages that are being spoken in facilities, so that we can help employers develop training materials in the languages that they need that are relevant to their plants. Then the stat I mentioned that jumped out at me was the number of vacant positions. And so when we had an average of just under 6 positions vacant in every for all of the respondents, and then we would say, okay, there's 7,800 employers in the sector in Canada. Like, if that average goes across, we're looking at 45,000 vacant positions in 2019, which is a huge amount. It's about 15% of the total workforce. And then we had that same amount, 14%, that is over 55. And so that's another 40,000 that are going to retire in the next decade. In the preparation for this survey, one of the things that we looked at was the recommendation by the Economic Agri-Food Strategy Table that set the target for 85 billion in exports by the year 2025. And in 2019, we worked out before we did this survey that we would need 65,000 new workers to meet that target. 48,000 of that was just replacing retiring workers. And so the number that we've got from this survey is sort of in line with what we had there. And the survey is going to feed into a larger report on the overall food and beverage processing sector. And right now our economists are just working on updating this number so that we'll have an up-to-date number when that report is released next month. And so make sure you go to the FPSC website to sign up for the newsletter so you don't miss that report launch. We asked everyone about the challenges that they're facing, and it's quite clear from this. We gave them 5 options: extreme challenge, somewhat of a challenge, little bit of challenge, not a challenge, and don't know. But availability of labor was far and away the #1 challenge of the 5 main options that we gave them. The other ones were regulatory requirements, implementing new technology, consumer trends, and waste reduction or environmental requirements. And then we gave them an option to put in other challenges that they were facing. Some of the examples of the other, because that rated an extreme for a number of respondents, we had things like business costs, financing, disease, importing, exporting, and specifically access to skilled labor as opposed to just availability of labor were there. Specifically on the labor, when we broke it down by sector respondents, labor was the #1, availability of labor was the #1 challenge that every sector indicated, and every region indicated as well, with the exception of Alberta, which had regulatory requirements slightly above. When I broke things up by regions, I used BC, Alberta as separate provinces, then combined Saskatchewan and Manitoba, kept Ontario and Quebec separate, and then combined the Atlantic provinces. So when I'm looking at regions, that's what we had. And then seafood processing had 85% of the respondents indicate that labor availability was a challenge, which was significantly higher than any other sector by about 15%. I think fruit and vegetable was the next highest at 70%. And if you want to know more specifically about seafood processing and their challenges, we have an entire labor market study on it on our website where you can get more into the details there. Compounding the labor availability challenge is the perception of the industry. So some of the reports that I've really enjoyed putting together have been on perceptions of different segments of the population. So earlier, actually at the end of last year, we released a study on generational perspectives in the labor force, looking at Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, boomers, and sort of what they look at for an employer and how that will affect that them all working together and what they want out of a workplace and what they want out of a coworker and a boss and those sorts of things. But we also asked them some general perception questions just about their openness to working in food and beverage processing specifically. And we had, in Quebec, only 15% of respondents indicated that that's something they would consider. And we had 35% in the rest of the country. When we did a 2018 survey that was focused on perceptions of the food and beverage processing industry, we found that it was 31% of the general public that would consider work in the sector. And so there is a silver lining with that. In the 2018 study, we also found that when respondents learned about the sector as a whole and what it was actually like as opposed to the notions that they brought with them, we saw between a 5 and 10% increase in every segment that we looked at in terms of their likelihood of considering work in the sector. So we know that education works to help build that gap, but it certainly is an uphill battle for everyone in the sector to recruit. Which leads to the next challenge that was indicated was when people are having difficulty recruiting, they often turn to technology as a way to reduce their labor demands. And so we looked at, we asked them what sort of challenge they were facing in terms of new technology implementation, as well as how integrated is their facility. So one of the things that we asked, we gave them a little bit of a primer on Industry 4.0 before the question. And I wanted to ask a follow-up question here, but I wasn't allowed by our survey partner because I'd already jammed too many questions into the survey. I'm curious about which, whether there was artisanal respondents where, like an artisanal baker or artisanal cheesemaker or something, where they're not going to be integrated by the nature of the way they operate their business, to sort of separate that out from a business that could be more integrated that isn't. And when we looked at the sort of sectors that indicated implementing new technology as a challenge, the highest response rate was in other food processors, where it was their number 2 option, and they were also the only sector that had more than 50% of respondents indicate that that was a challenge for them. Some of the other challenges that had sort of noteworthy aspects to them were, I called it sort of the relaxed prairies, because none of the 5 challenges that we put up had more than 50% of respondents indicate that was a challenge for them on the prairies. And that was also the same in the grain and oilseed and beverage sectors. So when we did the survey, at least there were certainly concerns, but they weren't sort of as visible as sort of, say, seafood, for example. Another interesting aspect was that waste reduction and environmental requirements consistently scored the lowest or second lowest in most sectors and regions. And then amongst sort of the second biggest challenges, it was in some areas and sectors it was regulatory. And so Alberta, that was their number 1 issue, and in bakeries it was number 2, but over 50% of respondents indicated that was a challenge for them. And then I think this one will be of interest to a number of people here, was that we asked them about how they would describe the educational programming designed to produce graduates for your sector. And we found that only 39% of our respondents considered it to be adequate. And I looked at that by where they sell their products, and there was a noticeable difference between respondents that export either to other countries, both, or the USA, where they were over 50% satisfied, as opposed to the ones that only sell within the province, or regionally, where it was quite a bit lower satisfaction level in the education that was producing graduates for their sector. And that might just be down to, if you're a small employer, the amount of tasks that someone is taking on is much greater, so it's harder to train someone to be ready to jump into that environment. When we look at it by sector, They had grain and oilseed and sugar and confectionery were both quite satisfied. Beverage was also near the 50% mark as well. Meat and seafood were the lowest. They were the only ones in the that were under 35%, and there weren't many between 35 and 40 either. So it was clearly those two sectors that were felt that the programming wasn't meeting their needs. And then regionally, it was there was only 9% difference between the bottom in Ontario and the top in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, that all had 45% there. And I think something that I've just anecdotally discovered in speaking with both employers and with academic institutions is that a lot of it's just down to demand and where they're located, because I've yet to talk to someone that was doing a program where their graduates weren't in high demand by industry. And so I think that it might just go back to the availability of labor, where it's so difficult to find people that when they're getting a graduate, they might have unrealistic expectations of what that graduate will be able to do for them. And that feeds into another question that we asked, which was around hiring and retaining challenges. And you'll notice that lack of qualified applicants and lack of applicants with proper training or certification are two of the top three challenges that people met. So that just feeds into how satisfied everyone is with the level of training that people are bringing with them, and how that affects their recruiting strategies. Switching gears a bit, we also asked them where they were in HACCP certification, and to try to find out if that's something where people are in that journey. And it was fairly similar to the chart that you're looking at right now is the overall responses. And most sectors and most regions fit that same distribution pattern. The only outliers were seafood, where it was 82% certified, and then a lot of our seafood respondents were based in Atlantic Canada, which drove their 2/3 being HACCP certified response. And we also asked them about whether or not cannabis was something that they were going to do now that it was legal, or would consider doing in the future. And so 4% of our respondents had said that they were already making cannabis products. And what I think was surprising was I expected that perhaps at a later date to be a lot more pronounced. I wasn't expecting it to be as small. This in sort of when we were doing our various labor market studies that Christy mentioned off the top, many of the employers that we spoke to were throwing around the idea of how they would, whether if they would get engaged in cannabis in the lead up to its legalization, and then how that would go. And so just in my own mind, I expected that percentage to be a lot larger. But at least BC came through and confirmed at least one of my stereotypes, and they were the most likely region to be considering making cannabis products. And we also did a complete report on cannabis industry that is available on our website, and I'm happy to share the link with you now, because that was my last slide. So thank you again for having me, and be sure to visit the website to gain access to all of our labor market information reports and other FPSC resources. And if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thanks very much, Kevin. We do have a few questions coming in already. I have several from CIFST President Amy Prue. And the first question is, the vacancy rate is concerning from a productivity and competitiveness perspective. CIFST has key partnerships with education partners for food science and food manufacturing leadership. What recommendations do you have for the education sector partners to do better, to do a better job serving the industry?
I think it's just about trying to make more connections, and it's something where whenever I've dealt with education institutions, they already have existing partnerships, so they're always looking to build more, and that's something that like one of FPSC's resources that we have is a learning and recognition framework, which maps out different skill sets, and there's a whole bunch of courses that feed into it, and we can work with, and it's been validated by industry, and we're working with education partners to match up, here's sort of the skill sets that employers have said they want, and so that then we can do sort of more micro-credentialing to get that, the sort of upskilling existing workforce, which will boost retention, but then also giving them new students sort of industry recognized skills to say, oh, I've got this level 1 credential from for this course that I've taken, and so that they have industry recognized stuff to bring with them. But I think there's still a lot of, there's a lot more demand, and I think industry needs to sort of throw out an olive branch as well to make sure that they're in contact with educational institutions in their area to tell them what they need. Because there's a lot of employers, especially food and beverage processing is a lot of rural employers, and so it's more difficult to make those connections in some of the areas where you don't necessarily, where your staff would have to go somewhere else to train, that it's more difficult. But I think as long as, if employers are making sure that they're reaching out, and I know that education institutions are also reaching out to try to find who they can partner with to offer co-op programs and those sorts of things to give their students a taste of real world experience, that you help to build those experiences. And so even if someone goes to a meat processing facility as a part of their education and they decide that they're going to work in a confectionery facility when they graduate, they still have that experience that they're bringing with them of working in a live environment.
Thank you. Her second question is, she was just going to ask about the skilled labor issue. How much of the need is skilled and technical labor versus general labor or trades?
I think it depends on, I don't have the actual stat in front of me for what we just used availability of labor in the survey, but what I've seen in some sectors, it's definitely, they're screaming for everyone, and so it's all of the positions. But if you ask them, they might say that they would need, 1 or 2 skilled people, but they need 25 people to just come in and work. And so that's sort of more where some of the focus tends to be. But in our upcoming report, we're trying, that's one of the areas that we're looking at is trades, because I know that some of the sectors, especially where you have trades, you need trades in your facility that can work in oil and gas or in another sector entirely, that there's a lot more competition for those. Like, just as an anecdote, there's a seafood plant that I spoke to that said, he lays off every single person except his HR manager, himself, and their chief engineer, because he's like, I can't risk him getting poached in the off season. So he just pays him for 4.5 months to do nothing, because they can't risk losing him to another sector.
Wow. A question from both an audience member and Amy, it's along the same lines. Did you collect data on wages and salaries? What would be the average, like what can an employer, how can you help an employer understand what to pay or what an employee would expect? And is there any linkage between the level of wages and the vacancy rates?
So for the first part, in this survey specifically, we didn't collect any of the wage information, but we are working on a compensation study that looks at 30 different food and beverage processing occupations, and we'll have that, it's coming out later in the spring, which will have that level of information. And also we have, as part of the meat and seafood studies, which we've completed, we did 26 regional studies where we looked at specific areas, and sort of just the labor market within a 50-kilometer circle that would be the sort of a standard commuting range. And we looked at the wages that are paid for specifically whether it's meat or seafood in that area compared to the other occupations in the area. And we looked at that, and we found, just speaking on some of the seafood, especially where it was, where they were more rural in nature, like they've certainly, some of them have tried raising their wages, and they said it certainly worked to get more people in the door, but they went out the door just as fast because it wasn't for them. And so we didn't speak to anyone that noticed that there had been a big uptick in terms of gaining staff by raising their wages significantly. Like no one was saying we're going to start paying $60 an hour or something like that to get people in. And then on the meat study, there was a lot of the facilities that we looked at that had significant labor issues were also unionized plants with all of the issues that people were telling us would fix seafood, like full-time, year-round, good wages and benefits were being offered at meat processing facilities, and they were still having the same labor issue. And so I think it's a bit with the perceptions that we encounter, where we know that the conditions in the facilities aren't for everyone, and we know that there's a whole segment of the population that don't consider it. And so certainly raising wages will gain a new segment that goes, oh, maybe I'll go do that. But whether they're that percentage that will actually carry on with the career is the challenge.
Thank you. Good point. I know, Kevin, you and I talked on the phone, I think, last year when I was just getting familiar with the industry, and this kind of extends on that point. Do you think some, like real estate, for example, in Quebec and Ontario in particular, in the heavy food and beverage processing areas, is very, very expensive? Do you think there's any merit in, if someone was to build a new facility or wanted to expand, going into a more rural area where perhaps the salaries offered, it does provide someone with a good living wage? The cost of living is lower in these areas. Like right now, I live in a very small town. We're seeing a huge influx of people escaping the GTA and buying up homes left, right, and center just to
I think
live more cheaply.
Yeah, that's something that we've heard, and there's been different communities involvement as well. So I would say to any employers that you want to work with your community to come up with that ad campaign, because it benefits the community just as much as your facility to get workers there. And there's people that will definitely appeal to, because I think, like for me, I grew up in Calgary, and at the time when I sort of graduated university, every house in Calgary cost $400,000, whether it was a one-bedroom apartment downtown or a big two-story house 35 minutes from downtown. It was all $400,000. And so in my mind, that was the price of property. But then when I'm talking to employers that are in small towns, they're like, yeah, you're going to be paying, $140 or $220 or whatever. And it's entirely different. You go, oh, wait, I could afford a house there. I could do this. And there was one employer I spoke to, and he made sure that every interview that he has, he mentions that because of where their facility is located, it's in a smaller town. He's like, my property taxes are lower, my house cost is lower, and I go to Mexico for 2 weeks every winter. And he's selling the whole lifestyle. And he's like, here's what your lifestyle is going to be like if you come work with us, and how that would be different. This is a big difference. So if you're making $50,000 and you're living in Cape Breton, it's very different than making $50,000 living in Halifax, and especially different than making $50,000 living in Toronto.
Right. Okay. I have another audience member question. What is the sense of urgency for skills in information technology, automation, blockchain, etc.?
I think that there's a high demand there, and what I've heard from employers is that the real challenge that they've got is a lot of them have multiple different machines that they use in their facility, and they don't have the capital at hand to upgrade the whole facility in one swoop. And so some of them are saying, we can't find a new technician that knows how to work on the old machines, so we can't find a guy that can work on the old machines that also works on the new machines. And so there's certainly a high demand there. But I've heard as well, like just in terms of how tech is going, there's so many more options for what you can do with new machines. And if you're building a new facility ground up, that you can incorporate a lot of people from the tech sector that would never consider food and beverage processing as a career path. And I think that that's one of the things that will help, is that if you start, and we're trying to do that with some of the occupations that we're looking at in our compensation study as well, is it's making sure that students especially are aware of the vastness of career opportunities, and especially operating machines and programming outputs, because every single facility that I've ever visited, I'm always in awe of how efficient it's all run. And it's like, you never picture what it's going to be like, but it's just go, whoa, this is more efficient than I thought it was going to be, in terms of how smoothly everything's always going.
Right. I think a lot of people don't understand really how our food is made. Do you think there's any value for educational institutions or even companies themselves to perhaps go to like a job fair, trade fair at some of the universities or colleges that offer, more of the robotics and computer programs, sort of think outside the box a little bit?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a room for a lot of different occupations. And I would almost say, rather than like trying to go too far, like if you offer up your facility to say, we'd like to take your robotics class through our facility, so that they can see it as like a field trip, as opposed to saying, can you send us 2 students to work here for 6 weeks or something? You might get more professors engaged that way, where you say, yeah, I want to show them different workplaces where you can use this. And I was speaking with someone just about physiotherapists, and the same thing. Like, I think when I was talking to people that were looking to do physiotherapists, none of them were picturing themselves in a meat facility, making sure that people were cutting meat the right way to not hurt themselves. But there's a whole bunch of different jobs where you can bring people through and go, oh, I never considered that I could work in this facility.
That's a great idea. I have a couple more questions. Next one, what is your take on these businesses or business orientation toward automation and robotics?
I think that one of the things I made a note to mention, and I didn't, so I'm glad this question came up, was within every sector, there's different technology that's available depending on sort of how global the commodity is. And we saw this really in our seafood study, where depending on what your actual product was, if you were doing anything with fish, there was a lot of automated technology, because every country in the world has some form of fish processing. And so there's huge markets for companies to develop fish automation technology. Whereas when you're looking at lobster was one example, where it's sort of like, okay, Atlantic Canada, Northeast United States, and then some different lobster species in Australia, and that's it. That's your market. And so there weren't big German companies developing lobster processing machines. And so even within seafood processing, there was a big disparity between the tech that's available. But everybody, like we saw, everybody mentioned availability of labor across the board as a challenge. And so we know that they need more people to come in, but they also, everyone is also trying to automate. And so any investments that they can make to automate, as every employer I spoke to said, yep, bringing in this machine to do this process is going to save me 20 people that I'm going to move to another part of my facility, because nobody's got enough staff. And so it's not replacing jobs, but there's certainly, there's a whole bunch of challenges around technology and funding and programs and things, where it's, I had one employer tell me that government was trying to get them funding, but they had to show how many jobs the technology was going to create. And I said, no, I'm bringing in the technology because I can't get enough people to do and they couldn't get the funding for it. And then someone else was able to fund a prototype, but not the commercialization of the prototype. And so there's all these different gaps in the system. But I think and just looking at the way that the population demographics are going for Canada, that we're going to need to keep bringing in more people to work. And I think looking at ways that we can automate, because there's always going to be jobs available. Just by the nature of food and beverage processing, it won't be possible for all the sectors to reach the level of automation that you might see in an auto manufacturing facility or something.
Great. Okay, last question. How are employers adapting workplace culture and environments to be appealing to youth and immigrants?
So that's something that we looked at with our generations report, which is really interesting, and about what they're looking for in a workplace, just to help give employers some of those tools and the ways that what they value. And so we discovered that one of the things that younger workers value is that they want to be able to make friends at work. They've sort of said, okay, I finished school, I'm making a new social circle, and it's going to be my coworkers are going to be a part of that. And so they want to have work-based social activities. Whereas we found with older workers that had been in the workforce for 30 years, they already had their social circle. And so that ranked quite low for them on that sort of piece. But we've also had like an anecdote. There was an employer that had a break room that was located a 5-minute walk from their main the processing line. And they discovered that what staff were doing was they all wanted to go check their messages on their phone. And so they made a batch of lockers right outside the processing line that were just tiny lockers that could hold people's electronics, so they could come out, check their phone, and go back in without doing that. And then there was another processor that had linked headphones to their employees' systems so that they could listen to their own music while they were working, but it was also, they could override and send out messages to stop work or whatever had to happen. And all of these like tech solutions to meet the needs of what their staff want, to try to keep everyone happy that's there. And so we've definitely seen that. We've also seen too with on the other end of the spectrum, for when you've got semi-retired workers that are in facilities, people have been trying to look at what lines they're running, or they might run this line once a week, so they bring in people to work an afternoon, or they try to change their shift start times to accommodate daycare drop-offs or school pickups or whatever it was, to make it the work schedule more flexible where they could. And so there's a variety of options there. It's mainly down to the workforce. And then on the immigrant side as well, it's learning about who you're bringing in. And what we found, so a lot of facilities will get, from wherever they're recruiting, they'll get a sort of, I call it like an anchor group. And then once they've got, 10 people from one country, then other people will come from that country to build the community. And so often that you'll have facilities where there might be, 10 different languages spoken, but if you provide training in Vietnamese, that will be really well received. Or if you add a Vietnamese meal to your staff cafeteria or something like that, to figure out what it is that you need. Like one of the facilities I spoke with on the meat study was a pork processing facility that came to the realization that they had a lot of staff that didn't eat pork that were working for them. And so when they had big staff barbecues, they stopped serving only pork, which was their normal tradition. They said, we adapted to meet the needs of our staff, and they just went with it. And so things like that, where it's just be receptive to who's actually working with you. Like you don't need to have a vast knowledge of like 800 different cultures. Or the same applies to Indigenous recruitment as well. Like often facilities and recruiters didn't have a great knowledge of their local nation that they were trying to recruit from. And we said, we don't need to worry about what the cultures are in BC when you're recruiting in Southern Ontario. You need to focus on the issues and the languages and the culture that you're recruiting from, because that's the only one you need to worry about. You're not recruiting a pan-Indigenous person. You're recruiting from a specific area with a specific culture.
That's really good. Thank you very much. So I don't have any more questions. So Kevin, on behalf of the Canadian Institute of Food Science and Technology and Food in Canada magazine, we thank you for your very informative presentation today. And a reminder to everyone that we're hosting webinars every second Wednesday until June, and then again from September to November. Our next webinar is on Wednesday, March 31st, and will feature Stuart Smith, who is an associate professor at the University of Saskatchewan. And his topic is on the Canadian consumer opinions regarding food purchase decisions. Registration is now open on the CIFST website. Thank you everyone for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.